Hey heroes, and welcome to another interdimensional episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an event of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. Previously on the channel, we talked in depth about the origins and history of the Squadron Supreme, the preeminent superhero team of Earth-712, also known as Earth-S, from their rise to power to their fall from grace. Of course, you can follow the links in the description to get all of the context, but when we last left off, the team's attempts to make the world a better place by seizing control of the United States culminated in a battle between the Squadron Supreme and the Redeemers, a group assembled by the original Squadron member Nighthawk to oppose them. This all resulted in the deaths of multiple heroes, including Nighthawk himself. In the wake of that tragedy, the Squadron decided to officially disband and began the process of dismantling the Utopia programs they had put into place. Of course, that also meant putting full control of the country back into the hands of democratically elected officials. Now, given how many characters are involved in all this, let's begin this week's drama by checking in with all of the surviving Squadron members as a way of reintroducing our key players. Mark Milton, aka Hyperion, the last surviving Eternal of the planet Argon, and a superhuman of exceptional power. As one of the group's founders and leaders, it was Hyperion who both started and ended the Squadron's takeover of America. I should also note that he was rendered completely blind during a battle with his evil doppelganger from Earth-616, but compensated with a pair of specially designed radar goggles that allowed him to perceive the shapes of solid objects. Zarda Shelton, aka Power Princess. A member of the long-lived and highly advanced Utopian race, Zarda stayed on Earth to strive for peace and prosperity when the rest of her people took to the stars. It was her ideals that inspired much of the Squadron's efforts, and when Hyperion was blinded, he made her the team's primary leader. After the death of her elderly husband, Zarda grew close with Hyperion, and the two began a serious relationship. Stanley Stewart, aka the Wizard, a super speedster who shares his codename with a World War II era hero from Earth-616, this Wizard was a founding member of the Squadron who stood by his allies throughout all of their ups and downs. Joe Ledger, aka Dr. Spectrum. During his time as an astronaut, Joe obtained an alien device called a power prism that allowed him to create solid energy constructs, among other abilities. During the climactic battle between the Squadron Supreme and Nighthawk's Redeemers, Dr. Spectrum's power prism was shattered, but the broken fragments embedded themselves in his body. As a result, he retained his abilities, but his entire body was rendered completely colorless while not using them. He was particularly affected by the deaths of his former comrades, especially that of his would-be lover, Olivia Underwood, aka Foxfire, and his old friend, Wyatt McDonald, aka the Golden Archer. They and other fallen heroes were placed in stasis in Squadron City's Hibernacle, and while there was little hope of reviving them, Dr. Spectrum vowed that he would make sure nobody pulled the plug onto them in the midst of the Utopia program's dismantling. Skymax, aka the Skrullian Skymaster. A shape-shifting alien from the Skrull Empire, he was the one who originally gave Joe Ledger his power prism and became one of the Squadron Supreme's original founding members, but left the group long before the Utopia program was even an idea. Without a ship capable of returning to Skrull space, Skymax was effectively stranded on Earth, but deceived his allies into thinking that he had left the planet and went into hiding while searching for a way to return home. Kingsley Rice, aka Amphibian. An amphibious mutant who could shift between human and aquatic forms, he voted against the Utopia program, but went along with the majority until they started using behavioral modification, or BMOD technology, to rehabilitate criminals through a form of brainwashing, at which point he quit the team in protest and returned to the sea. Linda Lewis, aka Lady Lark. She had sonic vocal powers and was originally partners with the Golden Archer, but during the Squadron's reign she grew close with another teammate, the Blue Eagle, who flew using a pair of artificial wings he inherited from his father. The Golden Archer tried to renew their relationship by using the BMOD machine on her, effectively brainwashing her into loving him again. That ultimately got him expelled from the team, and with no way to undo the brainwashing without risking permanent damage, Lady Lark left as well. She later returned to Squadron City after both the Golden Archer and the Blue Eagle were killed during the battle between the Squadron and the Redeemers. After that, while her mental programming caused her to mourn the Golden Archer, she ended up donning the Blue Eagle's wings and, gaining the ability to fly, rejoined the team as Skylark. Arcana Jones. A natural-born sorcerer and psychic, she used her powers as a professional crime fighter to support her family, which included her husband Philip and 3 kids, Drusilla, Katrina, and Andrew. She was actually pregnant in the midst of the Squadron's reign, but hid that fact from most of her teammates using her magic. She started going to labor during the battle between the Squadron and the Redeemers, but made it to a hospital and gave birth to her 4th child, Benjamin Thomas Jones. Speaking of which, Rayleigh Lund, aka The Shape. He was originally a supervillain who could stretch and contort his body, but was recruited into the Squadron Supreme after they used their BMOD machine to rehabilitate him. His brainwashing was later undone, but he elected to stay with the team because he had befriended Arcana's family in the interim and genuinely grew to care about them. And so he was actually the one who made sure that Arcana got to a hospital in time when she went into labor. It should also be noted that Arcana's newborn Benjamin possessed incredible mystical potential, even greater than that of his mother. Finally, we have Michael Redstone, Melissa Hanover, aka Moonglow, Harold Danforth, aka Haywire, and Edith Freiberg, aka Inertia. These 4 were all members of Nighthawk's Redeemers who infiltrated the Squadron, but after the battle between both sides resulted in their leader's death and the Squadron agreed to dismantle the Utopia programs, there was no reason to keep fighting each other. And so in the wake of all that, the surviving Redeemers remained in Squadron City, where Inertia and Haywire grew close and even started a relationship while relishing the fact that they were considered national heroes for their roles in deposing the Squadron Supreme. To be clear, while the Squadron attempted to enact policies and programs that would improve the overall health and happiness of the citizenry during their rule, there was always a contingent of the population that opposed and protested many of their decisions. In any event, the illusion-casting Moonglow felt out of place among the other heroes and was embarrassed by the fact that her teammates had seen her mundane, natural form when the illusion she projected around herself faltered. Meanwhile, before Hyperion and his allies had even finished dismantling their Utopia programs, their entire reality came under threat by a universe-consuming entity called the Nth Man. Now, we talked about his origins in last week's video, but for those who missed it, he was originally a man from Earth-712 named Thomas Leitner, who attempted to use a device called an Nth projector to endow himself with superhuman powers, but inadvertently transformed himself into a living multidimensional space warp. He was defeated by several heroes in that reality who caused his form to collapse in on itself. But he subsequently resurfaced in another parallel reality, and expanded until he absorbed everything within, before moving on to repeat the process, consuming a total of 7 universes. His presence in Reality 712 was detected by that dimension's Wizard Supreme, Professor Imam, who warned Hyperion and Power Princess of the impending danger. They gathered the remaining Squadron members, including the Redeemers, to combat this threat, and they were even aided by 2 of their greatest enemies, Emil Burbank, aka Master Menace, and the Scarlet Centurion, who you may recognize as a temporal variant of Kang the Conqueror. Although I should note that Amphibian and Skymax were still absent, since the former had quit the team and the latter was believed to be off-world at the time. But anyway, Burbank came up with a plan to use his dimensional aperture technology to banish the Nth Man from their reality. To modify his equipment and prepare for the battle, he traveled to the Scarlet Centurion's future timeline and spent a total of 15 years there building a trap for the Nth Man before returning to Earth-712 less than an hour after he'd left. When the heroes prepared to launch into space to spring this trap, using a ship built by Master Menace to do so, Power Princess insisted that Arcana stay behind, since she had recently given birth. However, when a frightened Moonglow quietly abandoned the group, Arcana secretly impersonated her and took her place on the ship, bringing her newborn with her while disguising him with magic. Now, things immediately got off to a bad start, as while the team made their way into space, Michael Redstone had a severely adverse reaction. The others deduced that his superhuman strength was tied to the Earth itself, and Dr. Spectrum attempted to return with him, but by the time they made a landfall, it was too late. Redstone was dead, and Earth-S had lost yet another hero. However, there was no time to mourn, as the squadron had less than 7 hours to stop the Nth Man before their entire universe was consumed. Hoping to buy them more time, Inertia attempted to use her powers to reverse the Nth Man's expansion, but even with Arcana and Imam attempting to brace her, this effort backfired completely, and Edith Freiberg's body was smashed into a fine pink mist as she was flung backwards. The intense forces punctured a hole in the ship's hull, sucking anything that remained of her out into space, before Arcana succeeded in sealing the breach with her magic. Running out of time, the squadron sprung the trap designed by Master Menace. However, it seems that their preparation and planning was all for naught, as Burbank's devices failed to affect the entity in any way. Dejected and defeated, Burbank fled to another dimension, leaving the others to their fate. Hyperion, Skylark, Dr. Spectrum, and the Wizard were all consumed by the Nth Man as he continued to expand. Professor Imam attempted to mystically commune with the Nth Man, and while he did learn of his origins, the strain was ultimately too much for Imam's aging body, and the Wizard Supreme perished as well. As he died, he passed his mantle on to the newborn Benjamin Thomas Jones, whose mystical potential made him a logical future successor, assuming he survived. The Scarlet Centurion, meanwhile, retrieved a potential future version of another squadron foe, the Overmind, who tried to use his psionic might to command the Nth Man to return from whence he came. Suffice it to say that didn't work either, and this divergent Overmind was killed as well. After that, the Scarlet Centurion also abandoned the heroes, ignoring Arcana's pleas to take her weak-old son with him. With no backup plans and seemingly no hope, the remaining squadron members sat and waited for the end to come. However, as time ran out, baby Benjamin reached out to Thomas Leitner, and the two made a deal. In essence, Benjamin offered to trade destinies with Leitner, becoming the Nth Man in his place. After that, the newborn not only ceased his expansion, but began undoing the damage Leitner had already done, and he vowed to retrace the Nth Man's steps backwards, restoring the universes he had consumed. Leitner, meanwhile, gained all of Benjamin's mystical potential, as well as the title of Wizard Supreme, along with all of the powers and responsibilities that came with it. In the wake of that, Hyperion, Skylark, the Wizard, and Dr. Spectrum were all restored, but there was nothing that could be done to help those that had been outright killed in the conflict. The survivors attempted to return to Earth, but Master Menace had one more trick up his sleeve, and their ship was diverted to Earth-616, where it crash-landed and was found by the cosmic hero Quasar. With no sign of Squadron City, the Wizard, worried about his wife and child, attacked Quasar, leading to a brief scuffle, but Arcana quickly deduced that they were on an alternate Earth, and it didn't take long for them to figure out which one. Soon afterwards, Hyperion befriended Quasar's ally, an Earth-born Eternal named Makari. Recognizing Hyperion as a fellow Eternal, Makari was able to teach him how to use his latent regenerative powers to restore his eyesight. For clarity, while there have been different Eternal races on various planets across the multiverse, the ones who lived on Hyperion's home planet of Argon originally migrated there from Earth-712, and so he and Makari were indeed the same species. But I digress. For the next part of our tale, we must turn our attention to the Squadron's former foe, the Overmind, who also resided on Earth-616. Now, we've talked in depth about the Overmind's origins in previous videos, so be sure to follow the links in the description for the full story, but here's an extremely abridged recap. The Overmind was originally created when the Eternals of planet Iyung transferred the minds of their entire population into the body of their greatest warrior, Grom. He later wound up on Earth-712 and began enacting a plan to crush that universe entirely, but was thwarted by the combined efforts of the Squadron Supreme, the Defenders of Earth-616, and a composite psionic entity known as Chorus, which was made up of the disembodied minds of 6 supercharged telepaths. In the end, Chorus inhabited and seized control of the Overmind's physical form, returning to Earth-616 with the Defenders, which is where we last left off with them. With Chorus as its primary persona, the Overmind stayed with the Defenders for a time, but eventually departed to wander the world, using their mental powers to prevent themselves from being noticed. However, when the Squadron Supreme arrived on Earth-616 after their battle with the Nth Man, the Overmind sensed their presence in his reality. As a result, his previous persona reawakened, and the 6 human telepaths who made up Chorus were completely subsumed by the minds of 1 billion Iyungian Eternals, as if they were drops of rain falling into the ocean. Seeking vengeance on his ancient enemy, a being known simply as the Stranger, the Overmind seized mental control over most of the visiting squadron. However, Hyperion remained free and joined forces with Quasar and Makari to save his teammates. The ensuing conflict seemingly drew the attention of numerous Watchers who had actually been consulting with the Stranger on an unrelated matter that concerned their own species. Unaware of their purpose there, unable to read their minds, and, quite frankly, no match for that many Watchers if they were there to oppose him, the Overmind's panic and paranoia caused him to inadvertently turn his psionic powers inward, allowing the Stranger to easily defeat him. Freed from the Overmind's control, the Squadron took up residence at Project PEGASUS, an alternative energy research facility run by the U.S. government. While there, Dr. Spectrum regained his multicolored appearance, but when Dr. Strange attempted to return the squadron to their home dimension, mystical forces prevented them from reaching their destination. Repelled back to Earth-616, the squadron subsequently spent several months at Project Pegasus, during which time they served as investigators for extra-dimensional phenomena, and defended the facility against several threats. Since that facility was where Thomas Leitner originally became the Nth Man, the squadron also held out hope that if they stayed there, they would eventually be reunited with Benjamin Jones, since he was retracing Leitner's steps backwards through the multiverse. However, Benjamin never arrived. Speaking of which, Arcana quickly deduced that Leitner was responsible for the squadron's inability to return home. As for the reason behind this, it seems that after the squadron were exiled to Reality 616, there was significant cosmic and mystic upheaval elsewhere in the Omniverse. Some sort of crisis that sundered both time and space, at the 0 hour of which worlds lived, worlds died, and nothing was ever the same. As the Wizard Supreme, Leitner studied the revised cosmos and got caught up in a war between cosmic entities known as Chance and Design, who ultimately came together to form an avatar named Kismet. One of Earth-712's mystical defenders, the Apparition, ceased to be as his human soul was laid to rest. Another, the Earl King, ascended beyond his previous role as a thing of the swamp. Perhaps most importantly, a higher dimensional entity known as Master Alternity, the omniversal patron saint of marvels, passed beyond the Omniverse as we know it. Having learned that Alternity had authored parts of his own story as well as the Squadron Supreme's, Leitner mourned his loss and was wary of those who would take his place in guiding their fates. In the midst of all of this, Leitner became known as Mysterium, and prevented the squadron's return for the sake of their own safety. In their absence, however, back on Earth-712, a group of corrupt businessmen called the Global Directorate rose to power using electoral fraud and utopian technology left behind by the squadron. They even used behavioral modification machines to enslave the former Master Menace, Emil Burbank, whose jaunt through time and dimensions had left him old and enfeebled. With nobody capable of stopping them, the Global Directorate took control of the entire planet, transforming it into a fascist dictatorship policed by armored troopers called Blue Eagles, a name co-opted from the deceased squadron member. This, however, inspired a new hero to rise up, Neil Jerome Richmond, the adopted son of Kyle Richmond aka Nighthawk. To briefly explain his backstory, he was the biological son of a criminal con artist turned psychopathic murderer, William Robinson, better known as the Huckster. When the Huckster died during a battle with Nighthawk, Richmond adopted the orphaned Neil and raised him as his own, passing on his knowledge, skills, and morality. As such, Neil looked up to and admired his adoptive father as he reached adulthood, but then Nighthawk was killed while defending freedom. Wanting to honor his father's legacy, when the Global Directorate came into power, Neil Richmond adopted the mantle of Nighthawk for himself. Having inherited his father's vast fortune, he began gathering an underground vigilante army to oppose the Global Directorate's fascist regime, although he often found it difficult to convince his followers to adhere to his own strict morals. Meanwhile, back on Earth-616, there was a criminal billionaire named Imus Champion who was collecting weapons and artifacts for his own purposes. During this time, Champion set his sights on a sunken alien warship that had been found in the ocean off the coast of northern Maine. For context, this particular spacecraft was originally part of Thanos' space fleet and had crashed on Earth during a conflict between the Mad Titan and the Avengers years earlier. To obtain this ship, Imus Champion conscripted a mind-controlling supervillain, Jackson Day, aka the Corruptor. Programmed via post-hypnotic suggestion, the Corruptor used an image inducer to disguise his appearance and infiltrated the Project Pegasus facility under the false identity of Project Administrator Andrew Kappelhoff. While there, he used his mental powers to manipulate the Squadron Supreme into battling the Avengers and retrieving the crashed warship. However, the Avengers subsequently investigated Project Pegasus and ultimately uncovered the Corruptor, freeing the Squadron from his control. While Champion had done his best to cover his bases and even attempted to hold a number of major American cities hostage, the Avengers and the Squadron joined forces to track him down and ultimately defeated him. In the wake of this, the heroes found, among the devices stolen by Champion, a prototype Nth projector. For those who may have missed last week's video, the Nth projectors were machines used by a group called the Nth Command to access other dimensions. And so Iron Man and his ally from yet another reality, Magdalene, were able to calibrate this early Nth projector and finally send the Squadron Supreme back to reality 712, along with their own spacecraft. However, one member, Haywire, decided to stay behind on Earth-616. Still reeling from the loss of his girlfriend, Inertia, it seems that he didn't have anyone else to return to, and elected to do some traveling alone. His decision to do so on Earth-616 was also in part because his home in the Pacific Northwest had been devastated by the various conflicts on Earth-712, and so he wanted to see a version of it that was still lush and healthy. In his solitude, however, he grew increasingly obsessed with his lost love to an unhealthy degree. He later came upon a battle between Thanos and Mantis and attempted to intervene, but as a result he was drawn into a larger conflict alongside the Avengers, a celestial quest involving powerful cosmic forces, the details of which we really don't have time to delve into this week. The important thing for today is that during this conflict, Haywire came face to face with the embodiment of death itself, and tried to convince her to resurrect Inertia. When Death refused, Haywire lashed out in anger and frustration, which only resulted in his own demise. Meanwhile, the rest of the Squadron emerged back in their native universe, but much like their journey to Earth-616, they encountered spatial turbulence on re-entry, causing their ship to crash. And while there were no fatalities on impact, Skylark and Shape were both injured and subsequently hospitalized. Arcana, meanwhile, rushed back to reunite with her husband and children, telling them what had happened to Benjamin. Soon afterwards, she was confronted by Tom Leitner, now known as Mysterium, who confirmed that in her absence, the mystical forces of her world had shifted, and that she would need to step away from the Squadron Supreme and take time to study the New Order, and essentially relearn magic entirely. Meanwhile, the other members of the Squadron learned of the Global Directorate and their jack-booted Blue Eagles. The Eagles attempted to arrest the Wizard by holding his wife and daughter hostage, but Madeline and Tina Stewart were fortunately rescued by the new Nighthawks vigilante army. After that, Mysterium appeared like a strange phantom and confronted the 4 remaining Squadron members, Hyperion, Power Princess, Dr. Spectrum, and the Wizard. He filled them in on some of what they had missed, albeit in a cryptic fashion, and advised them that in order for them to be victorious, they would need to once again unite a total of 7 heroes, referring to the missing as the In-Betweener, the Watcher, and the Dark Phoenix. For clarity, while each of these clues is also the name of a powerful cosmic entity in the Marvel Universe, in this instance they were referring to 3 specific missing heroes of Earth-712, and the squadron split up to find them. Power Princess tracked down their former teammate Amphibian, who lived in between 2 worlds, the land and the sea, and she ultimately convinced him to rejoin the squadron. Dr. Spectrum found his old ally, Skymax the Skrullian Skymaster, who had secretly been watching from the sidelines for years. Hyperion, meanwhile, confronted the new Nighthawk, and while he was hesitant to join them due to the circumstances of his father's death, he ultimately rose up to help the squadron when they launched an attack on Emil Burbank's fortress. Thus, the 7 founding members of the Squadron Supreme were reunited at last, and stood together in the fight against tyranny. They made their new home on Utopia Isle, where Power Princess had grown up, and brought the Wizard's family there for safety as well. I will note that during the battle at Burbank's fortress, Hyperion was shocked by the sad state of his old foe and brought him to Utopia Isle as well, preventing their foes from using his genius for their own purposes. While the squadron continued battling the Directorate's forces, there was also an incident in which Hyperion aided a team of dimension-hopping heroes called the Exiles in a battle against an evil version of himself from Earth-4023. I will note that he was also aided in this fight by yet another Hyperion who resembled his past self, complete with the radar vision goggles. While the heroes ultimately won that battle, the good Hyperions were wary of the Exiles and the power they wielded, not fully trusting them, with the exception of the mutant Beak, who originated from Earth-616 and recruited the heroic Hyperions in the first place. After all that, there was an incident in which the Exiles were pursuing a version of the body-stealing mutant Proteus across the multiverse. Note that this was not the Earth-616 incarnation of Proteus, but a counterpart from Earth-58163. In his travels across dimensions, this Proteus visited Earth-6375 in the year 2099, and possessed the local Hulk, John Eisenhart. While all that was happening, back on Earth-712, the Blue Eagles launched a massive attack on Utopia Isle. A desperate battle ensued, and the Squadron Supreme were nearly overwhelmed, but as luck would have it, the Proteus-possessed Hulk arrived and actually helped the squadron turn the tide. In the aftermath of that fight, Proteus claimed that the Exiles were after him because he tried to stop them after they ditched Beak and went rogue. The truth is that Beak had simply returned to his native reality, but this of course meant that he wasn't with them when the Exiles arrived on Earth-712, and Proteus slipped away again in the ensuing conflict. The Squadron Supreme ultimately overpowered the Exiles and put them on trial in an attempt to discover their true motives. Now, the story of the Exiles is somewhat complicated, so we won't delve into the details here, but suffice it to say, the squadron ultimately learned that the dimension-hopping heroes were doing their best to save all of the universes they visited. In the end, the Exiles even helped prove that the Global Directorate had used election fraud in their rise to power, giving the squadron the ammunition and the justification they needed to expose their crimes and topple their illegal regime. In return, Power Princess joined the Exiles in their hunt for Proteus, returning to Earth-712 after their mission was complete. Now, this would not be their last encounter with other dimensions. For example, there was an alternate universe designated Earth-31916, also known as the Supreme Power Universe, which had its own version of the Squadron Supreme, and while this incarnation of the team had many members in common, their history was quite different from that of Earth-712. Now, without getting into all the details, that version of the squadron ended up getting into a conflict with the heroes of yet another reality, Earth-1610, aka the Ultimate Universe. At the height of that battle, Wanda Lensher, the Scarlet Witch of Earth-1610, attempted to use her powers to end the conflict, but between the already unpredictable nature of her powers and the fact that they were in an alternate universe already, Wanda inadvertently summoned the Squadron Supreme of Earth-712, including Skylark, Arcana, and Shape, who had all fully recovered by this point. Suffice it to say, the whole situation was messy and devolved into a battle involving the heroes of 3 universes, but in the end, the 2 Arcanas helped the Scarlet Witch send the 712 squadron back to their native reality. Unfortunately, there was later a crisis in which the Squadron Supreme were unable to save their world, or even themselves. The Incursions, a wave of destruction rolling across the multiverse that caused parallel Earths to crash into each other, wiping out entire realities. After failing to save their own Earth, an injured Hyperion sent Power Princess through a dimensional portal they had constructed. She was shunted into a void between realities where she was eventually found by an alternate version of herself who had reached that void space through similar means. However, this other Zarda was actually an evil incarnation known as Warrior Woman, who was a member of her reality's Squadron Sinister. As such, rather than help her counterpart, Warrior Woman stole Power Princess's energy and ultimately escaped. Left in the void, Zarda's strong will to live allowed her to survive, and she ultimately escaped as well, resurfacing on Earth-616 several months after the crisis surrounding the incursions had passed. She soon discovered that Warrior Woman was also on Earth-616, and not only that, but she was impersonating her as Power Princess, and had joined forces with other heroes from destroyed Earths to form a new Squadron Supreme. This team included the Nighthawk from the aforementioned Supreme Power Universe, the Dr. Spectrum from the Great Society of Earth-429-0001, Blur, a paranormal from Earth-148611, aka the New Universe, and the Hyperion from Earth-13034, who had previously aided the Avengers during the incursions. Since that's a totally different version of the team, we're not going to get into their exploits here, but you can check out the Squadron Supreme series that ran between 2015 and 2017 for all the details. For now, I'll just point out that Warrior Woman's duplicity didn't go unnoticed for long, and the real Power Princess ultimately aided the new squadron in opposing her. Since then, Zarda Shelton has kept a low profile on Earth-616 and seemingly remains the last survivor of Earth-712's Squadron Supreme. However, given the fact that much of the multiverse was restored by the Molecule Man and the Future Foundation in the wake of the last Secret Wars, it's entirely possible that she may yet reunite with her teammates someday. In the meantime, that's all I've got for you this week, and thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here. Also, apologies to Edwin Rivers and anyone else whose name was missing from last week's video, that should all be fixed now. In any event, Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls, and if there is anything in particular that you want me to talk about, well, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!